The victim survival and witness are forms of heroism. This is a concept of heroism radically different from conventional models of Western tragic heroes who die nobly, especially in battle. Both defendants, Tellerian and Schwarzbard, were celebrated at the time because they were perceived to have fought back, though only because lawyers jumped through rhetorical hoops and transformed them into righteous avengers. Later, victims would not have to have fought back to prove their innocence or heroism. They merely had to survive. This portrait of survival, much later after the 1970s, became crucial in explaining why people subject to mass murder could not resist their persecutors, especially regarding European Jews who were murdered in Hitler's genocide. By the 1990s, survival itself became a form of resistance and bearing witness a new weapon of the powerless. 3. Finally, in these trials, we already see emerging the idea of a survivor who experiences a deep bond with those who perish and needs to recount their suffering to the world, not only in honor of their memory, but to assuage guilt and anxiety for having lived. This is the classic definition of a traumatized person now in Western psychiatry, that is the standard diagnosis of survivors of mass violence. Of course, other forms of mass violence are deliberate and strategic, imperial conquest and war, both. Wars are not necessarily, as we know, fought for noble causes. My point here is that for the first time in the West, interethnic and religious violence outside of an ostensibly free democratic West was not conceived as natural and regrettable, but understood to be a specific kind of violation of humanity. I should say that both Tellerian and Schwarzbard were figured in the trials, I didn't have time to address this, as Easterners. They were called by all kinds of racist stereotypes constantly, and I quoted a few of them, but the narrative was that they were clearly foreign, and they had to be brought in under the mantle of Western civilization. These trials begin to make an argument, however unwittingly and through the prism of the civilizing mission, that violence of this sort was not only a sign of group infighting for dominance, of conquest taking its toll on the innocent, of unconstrained human nature. In order to acquit victims of such crimes who had avenged the perpetrators, lawyers were forced to make arguments explaining why the violence did not fit a conventional script, that it was planned and deliberate collective murder rather than a byproduct of conquest, which of course was considered to be legitimate, that it was not perpetrated by rogue actors but by leaders who were responsible, that it targeted specific groups who posed no threat other than their ethnic difference. Victims were utterly innocent and could not die heroic deaths. Their miraculous survival was noble rather than to be pitied, and bearing witness was their reason for living. This concept of witness as a form of political morality would be developed more fully, as I mentioned, after 1970 in the wake of the genocide of European Jewry, and then applied retroactively to victims of colonial violence. And here, I'll show something. Let me go here. If you look, this is just a Google Ngram, but if you look at genocide, obviously, it's coined in 1940. You see there's a slight thickening of the line around 1920. That's because of the Armenian genocide, which makes no sense since the word genocide actually had not been coined yet. So this is just a Google problem, or people using the term anachronistically. So you can see what happens is that in 1940, it begins to gain some traction, but very, very little. And then by 1960, 61 is the date of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, in which the SS commander, Nazi Adolf Eichmann, is convicted. And look at what happens by the year 2000, it's everywhere. So it actually takes quite a long time to become a rather conventional way of talking about mass murder, and it's rarely used as a legal category for reasons of great power conflict. So that's interesting. And then I wanted to, I think here. Whoops. Okay, so, and you can see what's happened since the 1990s, especially as with the war against the bombing of Belgrade, and then the Rwandan genocide in 1994. You see this, these are whole book series, Witness to Genocide. These are indigenous peoples in Guatemala. This is obviously in northern Iraq. And this is a whole series, Bearing Witness. And you can see all of this is being conflated or called genocide. And you see the Bosnian situation that you can't see the whole thing. It's being called ethnic cleansing, though the series is called Genocide and Ethnic Cleansing because the differences are very hard to define. And there are books written about what the differences are, none of which are wholly convincing. And so part of my effort here is to say, well, how did we start thinking about genocide as a particular form of violence in the first place? Okay, so I mentioned that these bearing witness, as you can see, is retroactively applied to victims of colonial violence. Now, most ironic, and this is something I do in the end of the book, and I couldn't address it here, but I'll just finish on this note. Most ironic is that just as imperial genocides have been called by their names, genocide has become a seemingly permanent part of our geopolitical landscape, and the vast majority of perpetrators now brought before the International Criminal Court, which only started working in 2002 as an independent court, hail from the global south. The recognition of genocide may have been part of a Western self-reckoning, which it was after the Second World War, but it now appears to have become part of a new script decrying horrors elsewhere. We may be back to the beginning, in which the deliberate violence of post-imperial wars is waged once again in the name of civilization, now termed humanity, cast in the image of a free and democratic West. Thank you. Do you have questions? Or? Oh, you don't have a question?
Yes.
Oh, I thought.
So we just heard a fascinating lecture. The floor is open. Professor Jean will take questions. So please feel free to ask questions. Please keep your questions short and to the point. And please identify yourself briefly before.
Yes, my name is Sajid Ali, and I would like to say that as we have come to the conclusion that genocide is not an ancient problem which was there at the time of Moses and in Egypt, but it has come down all the way to the modern times also. As you say, in Canada, the First Nations, there was agricultural genocide. Now they don't know their identity. Those people who first migrated to Canada, who first went to Canada. So what more do you want to say about this? I'm interested in this topic.
Of indigenous peoples, or I'm not...
Also them, yes. Sorry.
The question is the identity of the immigrants to Canada?
Also the immigrants, they also lost their identity, and the people who were there, Indians, the Red Indians, in fact, yes.
You mean how are they victims of genocide, or how is that defined more or less?
Would you describe that as a genocide?
Cultural genocide.
The Native Americans and...
Yes.
Most of this, at least I'm not an expert on, obviously, on the genocide of indigenous peoples. There are people in this room, I'm sure, who are far more expert. But certainly the people who are expert describe, now the word is settler colonialism, which means empires that settle in various places and annihilate it in various ways the indigenous peoples who live there. And that would be true of the indigenous peoples of what is now called Canada, as well as the United States, and in Latin America, what we now call Latin America as well, and Australia, Tasmania, the entire area of the British Empire, not all parts of it. And there's a lot of controversy about that definition, but that is it's used in all kinds of places. There's even a lot of controversy about who is indigenous. I think it's pretty clear in the case of the modern United States, Canada, and other areas. It's less clear in other areas of the world, but what indigenous means has become a legally very important term because it means you are native to the land. And so legally, to make claims based on your relationship to the land is a crucial legal category in indigeneity is very, very important. So my understanding is that this is why it's a subject of much discussion and debate. I don't know if that satisfies you, but.
Good evening, Anthony Kashtorian. I'm one of the few Armenians here, and my family a long time ago were from this region of Turkey, but we left before any of this happened. We moved off to Persia, and then via there came to India. What I wanted to ask you is, I'm one of the black sheep in the community. I'm not entirely convinced that the Turks targeted us because we are Armenians. I'm of the view that if that community there happened to be Hindus who joined the Russians against the Germans, or Muslims who joined the Russians against the Germans, the Turks would have wiped them out too. Unlike what Hitler did to the Jews, which was very specific, very targeted and unambiguous, there's no doubt there. Do you think I'm wrong in that? Do you think they were specifically targeted for being Armenians? Or do you think they were targeted because they had taken the wrong side in this war?
Well, that's a very difficult question, and as you know very well, there are many sides to this, and we can't. There is obviously the Turkish government puts restrictions on the kind of research one can do in the archives. So there are people who have been able to research this topic, but we still don't know everything that might be there. What's most exciting is the German government opened its foreign correspondence, so we can see more than we ever have been able to before, so we know what the German responsibility for the genocide. I guess the way I would answer is as a historian and say that the Armenians were there. In other words, they were the people that were murdered, and there were many reasons for that. They were, as you know, Christian. They were, some were allied with the Russians, but others were living in villages. They were not fighting with the Russians. They may have had sympathies that way. I think it's very hard to argue that the Armenians were an actual threat to the Turkish Republic, the burgeoning Turkish Republic, and the Turkish nationalists. The historians' arguments now, let me just summarize it that way, since my own opinion is not very important, but which is that the history of genocide has now been, how can I put this? Rather than being seen as centered on the Holocaust of European Jewry, it's obviously been expanded, but also the history of genocide has been seen as originating now in the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and the Russian Empire. So that in the dissolution of these empires and the rise of extreme nationalism, you see for the first time outside of an imperial context, huge population transfers, expulsions, and murder. And so many historians would argue that the Armenian genocide is part of this general development, this global, what we could see as a more global development. So I guess the idea that there would be any group would, as a historian, would be hard to argue, because historians have to say, well, who was there? Why did this happen? So whether the evidence is there for Armenian betrayal, it was certainly used rhetorically to legitimate the genocide after the fact. Certainly it's hard, the assassination of, the roundup and assassination of prominent Armenians in Istanbul and their murder is hard to explain that way. But certainly, in particular, all the little villages in Anatolia were no threat to Turkish nationalism. And so if you just define it in that way, it's really hard to legitimate or justify. In fact, that is what the German conservative nationalists argued, right? That even in this trial, it was very complicated. I don't know if that answers your question. I would contextualize it very differently than you have, that's all.
Good evening, I am Sumit. I am basically a lawyer. So I want to mention with respect to the context with respect to India. So almost all of you are aware of the anti-Sikh pogrom which happened in India in 1984, aftermath the death of the assassination of Indira Gandhi. So the Delhi High Court a few months back, it recognized the 1984 anti-Sikh pogrom as a genocide. Probably the first time it happened that a constitutional court recognizing it, although India ratifying the genocide convention doesn't have a law to define what is genocide and the punishment for that. Now, contrary to that, I want to mention that the Indian Supreme Court, the highest constitutional court in India, it had taken contrary decisions on two aspects. One was with respect to the reinvestigation of the closed cases with respect to the 1984 Sikh riots, and where it ordered the reinvestigation into more than 200 cases that were closed by the police because the so-called political party was in power. However, the same Supreme Court, one of the judge of that was the judge in the other case. There was a petition filed by a Kashmiri Pandit organization called Roots in Kashmir. They also wanted reinvestigation into cases, around 215 cases that were closed by the government. And so they cited also the video evidences also where the former terrorists or the militants, they were admitting that they committed so and so crimes. So the thing is, whereas one high court, which is a lower court recognizing in genocide, whereas the highest court of the land, it is not recognizing, it is taking different approaches, although one, at least one of the judges being same in the thing. So what do you say about this?
I guess that's a level of detail that you clearly are very knowledgeable. I guess what I would say is that defining whether genocide is genocide legally and how it's done is a political problem, of course, a political question, and not a conceptual question always. And that's only what historians work on. I guess what I would say then is that what this suggests, your story suggests that there's not going to be international recognition for some genocides, right? And that it takes a lot of political work and legal work for a genocide of any sort to be recognized because of the obligations that the political and even military, as problematic as that is, obligations and moral obligations that ostensibly come with the naming of a particular set of crimes or a crime as a genocide. And so in this case, to have claimed a genocide, first of all, it's, in India it's very complex, right? It even is complex abroad. If you witness the Canadian-Indian situation that Trudeau brought about by meeting the representative of the Sikhs. So I think that it tells you that what the interesting questions for a historian would be why is this happening now? You could come up with a lot of answers. What are the legal? How is the legal apparatus allowing it at this moment? What is the tension between the lower courts and the high court? Obviously, this is a very complicated question, and how are other communities responding to this? This is clearly a problem also of cultural memory, right? And genocide is not as universal as it's supposed to be. It's very complicated. What is a genocide? I'm not sure the legal definition is so vague as to be really hard to enforce or to make sense of. And so the last thing I'll say is that there's a reason we have a cultural meaning attributed to it so that it becomes recognizable. Because politically, most state actors would not recognize genocide. I mean, it's very well known that the Genocide Convention was essentially toothless. It was passed in 1948, and it's toothless precisely because there was absolutely no will on the part of any sovereign power, sovereign state, to interfere in the affairs of another. And this is particularly true of the imperial powers, right? Because the British wrote memos, alarm memos, when there was going to be an investigation into crimes in Tunisia by an NGO in the 50s, saying no, we can't allow this regime to be criticized, or else we'll be criticized. Right? This is very common. So this is why it took as you must know, it took until 2002 for an international course to be operative. And the United States is not a signatory, for obvious reasons, because they would always be in the dock. So it's a real problem.
You spoke about genocide. Now there's also the politics of apology that has slowly started to take shape across the globe. So what is the history of apology now? In a brief history, especially with Armenia, it came up when I think Barack Obama had, I think Barack Obama didn't refer to it as genocide when he went to Turkey. So what is the politics of apology?
Oh, that's a very, very difficult question, actually, because on the one hand, I don't know how people would feel. On the one hand, it seems apology is crucial because it's about recognition. And recognition is the first step to anything, right? To any kind of political action. The problem, of course, is that already, and this is on the right and the left both, so it's across the political spectrum, the politics of apology has been interpreted as a merely cynical, empty exercise. That is, there can be apologies to some peoples, but the Turks are NATO allies, therefore we don't apologize, right? The French government was fairly brave simply by calling the genocide a genocide. So I guess one of the things, I don't have very much interesting to say, I don't think, but I think what I could say is that I find both the idea that apology is necessary very compelling, because for an empire, for representatives of a former empire to recognize that they actually committed crimes still today is absolutely crucial. Now, one can also think it's sort of silly. I mean, Macron, the Prime Minister of France, the President of France, I'm sorry, he acknowledged that the Algerian war, that French soldiers committed torture. But he apologized on behalf of a French activist who was against colonial crimes. He didn't apologize on behalf of the French government to Algerians. So that is the kind of thing I think that feeds the cynicism that these apologies are almost always cynical political, are often, I shouldn't say always, are often cynical political strategies. And so for the people especially now in post-colony, in post-colonial states, they don't need apologies, I suspect, anymore. Though it may make people in other kinds of contexts feel good about